how much does insulation help to reduce CO2 emissions? And as above with solar panels in reducing energy use.
So I think to get into details about emissions, I think you're going to hear more about that next. Not necessarily about the specifics of insulation, but I think, yeah, the details of where emissions are coming from in different sectors. But in principle, insulation will help because a lot of our homes are pretty leaky in terms of heat. So yeah, it can make a huge difference by making sure that we're not wasting a lot of the energy that we're burning the fossil fuels to generate in the first place. So then we're just reducing the demand. You know, if you can keep the heat in your house, you just need to generate less energy in the first place. I think I am not an expert on buildings, so I'm certainly not going to be able to give you a specific kind of percentage of how much it'll help. But it makes a huge difference, and a lot of buildings in the UK, a lot of our houses are really old, and they're just, you know, they weren't built with this in mind, and there's a lot we can do. You might hear people saying retrofitting, which is just, you know, putting new technologies into older houses to prevent them from kind of losing a lot of heat. And then the other question was about solar power, but do you mind just repeating it?
Indeed, yeah. So it's how much does sort of solar panels reduce energy use? So I suppose that's what from the grid, I suppose, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So again, if you, as a home or a business, if you've got a solar panel that can generate a bit of your energy, so that you're then having to use less energy either from gas or from electricity that you're getting from outside. Again, the specifics of it will really, really depend. I think it's not something that people think of automatically in this country because it's not that sunny all the time, but actually you can generate quite a lot of solar power. I don't know if you're going to talk about solar or anything next.
I can definitely do that if people want to. I'm going to talk about emissions and who's responsible for what and all the different types of emissions next week. But happy to chip in if it helps.
Yeah, so I think it's one of those things where the more we can do to replace the amount of either gas or electricity that we're bringing into our homes from external sources, the better. So both of those things would achieve that.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Are you happy to read your question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So we'll move on to Michael's question now. Would you have to cover
Read
all
them,
of them?
yeah.
Right.
I'll read them. So I've said, doesn't the Earth temperature fluctuate without human involvement? Hasn't the planet been through different climate cycles before the Industrial Revolution?
Yes, you're absolutely right. It has. And I didn't talk about that at all. So that's a thing that I missed out. So it does. There's different things that affect that. So basically the Earth is constantly spinning around. It's a slightly different distance away from the sun at different times in that process. So that is what controls those kind of like longer term fluctuations in the temperature. What we're seeing at the moment though is a big change in temperature over a really short period of time, which we have not seen before. It's much, much more rapid than things that have been experienced previously. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It can change because of natural processes, but we've tried to, I say we, scientists in general, have tried to sort of recreate the natural influences on the Earth in computer models, in various calculations, and said, well, how much do we think that has affected the temperature over this period of time? And just not enough has happened for us to be able to blame those natural things. So you're absolutely right. Natural stuff can absolutely affect the climate, but it just not this quickly and not this much. Yeah.
Okay, I think there's a bit of a follow-on on that. So, are we not best just focusing on adapting to the change in temperature rather than spending a lot of money fighting it if it is inevitable that it will happen?
Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to do both, because we are going to have to adapt to what is now seeming inevitable, which is the change that's happened so far and the kind of changes that are likely to happen in the next few decades. But unless we also try and mitigate, so basically reduce our emissions as much as possible, we are going to push things beyond what we can adapt to, I would say. So I think you're right. we are gonna have to do both. And in different places, it might be a slightly different balance. So there'll be some parts of the world where there's not as much adaptation needed, let's say, and there'll be some parts of the world where actually thinking about, you know, islands that are very low lying compared to the height of the sea. You know, there's no point them spending all their money on reducing their emissions when actually, unless they build flood defences and kind of physical structures, they're going to be underwater. So yeah, the balance is different in different places, that's true.
So how does climate change damage coral reefs? And how does it make flooding more likely?
Yeah, two great, that was your group, yeah? So the coral reefs, there's a couple of different things that happen. So the oceans are getting warmer, not as much as the land, but they are still getting warmer, and that damages the coral reefs. But they're also affected by the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the water. So the more carbon dioxide we put in the air, actually only about half of what we put into the air stays in the air. The other half gets taken up by the oceans, but it also gets taken up by the trees that we've got growing on the land. So a lot of it is going into these kind of natural places. The oceans is one of them. So the more carbon dioxide that is in the ocean, that also damages the coral reefs. The other question was about, flooding. There's a couple of reasons for that. So the warmer it gets, the sea levels around the world will rise. Basically, they'll rise more the warmer it gets. And that's partly because of things melting, so glaciers melting, big blocks of ice on the sea melting, but it's also just because the water we have in the oceans, as it gets a bit warmer, it expands and takes up a bit more space. So that's actually the most important process. So as it gets warmer, it's kind of pushing those sea levels higher. So where you've got, like the islands I was just talking about, where they're at a really low level, they can't really afford for sea levels to go up very much because it really makes a huge difference to how much land they actually have.
Yeah, I found that fascinating because I grew up in the Fens, Boston, Lincolnshire, so my house was 16 foot below sea level. So the home insurance is around there because of it.
Yeah. So there's issues on the coast in terms of sea level, but then you've also got the changes that we're likely to see. So taking the UK as an example, what we think will happen is that as it gets warmer, rainfall will, in the winter, we'll see kind of like heavier rainfall, and it will fall in sort of more intense bursts. So then it's not even just a case of coastal flooding, it's actual like inland flooding from the rivers, which we already see. I mean, I live in Otley, and we've had many years of flooding. Every time there's heavy rainfall, the rivers just can't cope with it. So some of that is made worse by climate change as well.
Can I just ask a question? It's just following up from coral reef. Like, that's dying because of the carbon dioxide. And like trees and other plants and stuff like that absorb it. Does it damage them in any way, like it does the coral? Yeah.
So trees are taking in carbon, and any plants actually with leaves. Yeah. So they're taking carbon dioxide in just as their normal photosynthesis, like how they need it actually. That's part of their of how they generate their food. But it can start to damage them once the amount in the air gets too high. The other thing that we think will happen, I'm saying think because this one isn't a fact, this is just what we think, that actually as the climate warms, the fact that the temperatures are higher might start to damage trees before they have damage from other things. So that's a really kind of, that's something that actually we don't have a good specific idea of exactly how much warming the world's forests can kind of tolerate, basically.
It depends on the trees as well. In London, they plant the London poplars, which deal with pollution. It collects in the bark and the bark peels off and falls off. So it's got built-in protection. Yeah. But that's of one species, the rest is damaged.
Yeah. You ready to read your question?
think London Plain actually.
Yeah, London Plain.
Microphone for your acceptance speech.
To the whole, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, dogs and cats, don't forget goldfish. Hi there. My question is about methane gas, right? Is there any positive use for it, since it seems to happen as a byproduct of waste treatment, and it happens as a byproduct of cows with the four stomachs and everything? So is there any positive use for it, instead of it going out to the air and being a chlorofluorocarbon?
So, for the
Methane gas.
the methane, yeah. So, yeah, methane is a greenhouse gas as well. Most of it comes from, as you say, cows, basically. There's no... It's difficult, really, to do much about methane coming from animals other than have fewer of them, really. So people have tried things like changing the feed that the animals have, or changing the kind of like adding enzymes and things to their food to try and get them to produce less methane. But was your question more about, is there stuff we can actually do with it?
A positive use, like say, instead of letting it go out, we know like it's combustible, like if it's say after waste treatment, right? So if it's left in say in closed spaces, it's quite combustible, right?
Yeah.
So if say elements of that, like, can that be taken and turned into say heat or electricity or?
Yeah, I don't know about gas directly from animals, but people definitely do use biogas, basically for generating heat. So yeah, you're right. It is something that people are doing. I don't know how much of a contribution that can make to the... Yeah, so it's not something you'd probably be able to do at a farm level, kind of collecting the methane, I guess, from the animals. That would be quite difficult.
Can you imagine the poor milkmaid trying to collect it?
That's great. Thank you. Would you like to read yours?
Yeah.
Just the interesting question about nuclear energy.
Well, yeah, all sorts really. It's basically about power generation and replacing fossil fuels. And,
Yeah.
It's a bit of not only, obviously we're building Sizewell C at the minute, this massive new place in the southwest, but it's also wind and hydro. It's a good idea with wind farms and that, but you've got the argument how bad they look and where they're put. Obviously it's green energy, and then you've got the argument with hydro as well, where they're put and how bad they look, although it's green energy. But then nuclear energy is meant to be the latest government's green answer to... So what is... you've got the argument about wind farms and hydro, but then you've got where they're put, and, and then you've got the nuclear argument. They're building this massive new nuclear plant on the Severn Estuary that's meant to be the answer, that's non-polluting, but is it and isn't it? And we know all about nuclear waste.
But an experimental fusion reactor.
Oh yeah, okay.
Difference between fission and fusion. Fission is splitting the atom and using the energy it releases. Fusion is actually combining two atoms and creating energy that way, which is supposed to be millions of times safer. And they've had a breakthrough in the last few years, which is really right. I don't know how advanced it is.
Yeah, but they're spending billions, and the Sizewell C is way beyond budget, and it's meant to be the answer for...
I think it's really tricky, because there's no one thing that's going to just be able to replace all of our energy generation from fossil fuels, I think. So it's going to take a bit of everything, and like you say, there's sort of, not necessarily downsides, but there are things that people might object to or think are good about all of these different energy things. I know there was also, a big thing about politicians having views about solar farms, and there's kind of, people have opinions about these things. People value their views of landscapes, and so if you say we're going to put a wind turbine there, they might have an opinion about that. With nuclear, it's really complicated because you're creating a different kind of waste. So it is low carbon. It is better from a carbon perspective. You're still creating waste, and I think we're sort of at the situation now where I'm not sure we have a lot of choice. I think we are going to have to do that, but it's not without its own issues, I don't think either. And it's a really complicated issue. I think there's a lot of environmentalists that kind of like come down on either side of it. I think most people are kind of reluctantly accept that we're probably going to need to do it, but it's not perfect.
I mean, Sellafield deal with import waste from other countries, and we'll deal with other people's waste, don't we? So it's just the whole thing fascinates me, being the engineer in me.
Yeah.
So
it's...
I don't know. I just thought...
It's really interesting, because I think you've hit on there why we haven't sorted this out yet. Because if there was some other technology that we were like, yeah, okay, that can just generate all our energy and nobody minds, it's not causing any problems in any other ways, we probably would have done it by now. But it doesn't really exist. There isn't anything that everyone's just like
it's like you
on
said
board
about
with.
being a scientist, there's never a perfect answer. Everything's evolving, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's the kind of thing where if you were, the local communities living around either wind turbines, living around nuclear plants, they're probably going to have their own views about whether they want that in their kind of region. So, it's really complicated. I don't think there's an answer. Sorry.
Thank you. Okay. It's just a kind of general question, because you've got there, we know what we need to do to avoid the worst, and then as your profession as an environmental scientist, what's your biggest perceived barrier to actually getting stuff done? Like, what's actually coming back? And I mean, I don't know if that's what you study, if that's adjacent to what you do. I was just interested in your view on that.
Yeah, and in terms of the barriers. That's a really tough question. I think, yes, when I say there, we know what we need to do. And then I've spent the last few minutes sort of not being able to say exactly what we should do. So we know what we need to do in the sense that we know what we're doing, that we need to stop doing, but it's how we enable ourselves to continue doing the things that we want to do whilst not having such an impact on the environment. So I think, and that's broadly where I think the barrier is that until the damage to the environment is viewed as important enough to stop doing these things, then we're probably never going to tip that.
And do you find that it's not treated as important?
I think it really depends who you if I talk to my colleagues and talk to other people at the university, probably everyone's very bothered about climate change. But you only have to look at what's going on in the politics in this country right now to see that it's not a big priority for the current government.
And I was going to say, like, the work you do, where does that feed up to, other than just academia? Is it going?
It is. So I guess some of the specific stuff. So I said that my work is looking and thinking about trees and their impact. So we work with, in Leeds, we work with the City Council, we work with other local authorities to try and understand how much of a difference planting woodlands in different places could actually make to our sort of carbon, that balance between what we're emitting and how much carbon we're drawing down. And recently, there's been a lot more interest in actually doing those kinds of things. So creating woodlands, taking that carbon out of the atmosphere. But it's all very dependent on funding really coming from central government. The regional governments can only do things if they can get the money coming from the national government. So the things that have been said in the past week or so about some of the changes that are now being thought aren't going to happen, things that were supposed to be policies that were meant to be coming in that might not now happen, are really, I think, going in the wrong direction.
Thank you.
So we know that there are political parties ignoring climate change. How do you put pressure on them to do so?
That's a great question. So it's really tough. I think obviously voting for the political parties that seem to be taking it seriously is one step, but that you only have the chance to do that when there's an election. So when governments are not taking it seriously, one thing that I know did have a big impact a few years ago, so before the pandemic, there was, you might know, being involved with or know about the kind of youth strikes about climate change, and people, essentially going on strike to make the point that we care about the climate and we want things to change. And that had a really big impact on the government at the time, because that was when they agreed to commit to the legislation about getting to net zero by 2050. And that's now like it's essentially legally binding commitment that the government made. And there was kind of pressure coming from lots of different places. So there was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who are like the sort of global body who synthesize all the climate change research. They were basically saying, look, this is what you've got to do. You need to reduce emissions. This is how fast you need to do it. And then at the same time, these strikes were happening, people were protesting. It just created a real, I think the government then, they couldn't not do something about it. And so they put that legislation in place. Now, the problem is that they actually have to have a plan of how they're going to deliver on that. So that's where we need to keep up the pressure to say, okay, it's fine to say we're going to commit to doing a certain thing, especially when it's in 20 odd years' time and the people who are currently in government aren't going to be there anymore. They're not really saying that they are going to do it. So it's the details, it's how exactly we are going to transition to cleaner energy. And when things come up like, oh, let's do fracking again, when these ideas kind of resurface, it's having that vocal opposition to say, actually, no, because we're in this climate situation and we need to do something about it. And I think, it's being as vocal as possible.
You can join like pressure groups, say like Greenpeace, and like you have Extinction Rebellion, who are like participating in civil disobedience. Do you think they put a bad name on climate change? Because a lot of people, I think there was a survey that went out and most people think that they are bad and have a negative view of them because of the damage that they cause. Do you think that's a good or a bad thing?
It's so hard. That's so hard. I can only give you my personal opinion, really, because I don't know, how much it changes things. I think every individual would have to decide, okay, what am I prepared to do for this particular cause? How strongly do I feel about it? And not even that, like what kind of disruption am I willing to cause? Going on a protest is one thing, but taking it to the next level in terms of activism is not something that everybody wants to do. So everyone's got to find their kind of level that they're comfortable making their opinion known at, I would say.
It's a personal thing, I would imagine. I mean, without political action, you ladies wouldn't have a vote. But if situations where motorways grind to a standstill and irate motorists want to take the law into their own hands, it's a balancing act. You've highlighted your cause, but at what cost?
I think we've got time for one more question, but are you happy to answer some by email?
Definitely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so our group was talking a lot about, what can we do, this and that. But I think like a really overarching problem that a lot of us feel is like, how do we not give up hope on the situation? And, how do we not just feel like, well, what's the point?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I find myself wondering the same thing sometimes. I think being part of this process is a really, really positive thing that you're all doing. So I would firstly look to that. So it can seem a bit hopeless when you're confronted with all that information if nothing is being done about it. But I think being part of something that is doing something very practical in a really meaningful way, like the outcomes from this process are going to be so important for your local region, that I think is one of the most positive things you can do. So I guess that would be my feeling is, we can't give up hope, because otherwise the people around the world who have interests in things staying as they are will just succeed in doing that if everyone who doesn't want that to happen and wants things to change just gives up. And that's what they want, really. So I think, it's doing small things, making small changes, but feeling like you are able to have a difference. And yeah, I think taking part in this process is absolutely one of the best things you can do. So yeah, good work.
Brilliant. I think with a lot of the questions, I think these are directed to you already. So these are for you. I'll take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much.